All right, so we're diving into human trafficking in the U.S. today, and wow,
Big topic.
yeah, a mountain of information, and we're using a Wikipedia article as our starting point.
Okay, yeah, that's a good resource for a broad overview.
Exactly, it's like our cheat sheet,
Right.
and luckily we've got you here to help us sort through it all. You're the expert who can help us.
Well, I'm happy to help connect the dots.
So our mission today is to unravel this hidden world, understand what human trafficking really is and what's being done to fight it.
All right, let's do it.
All while keeping our listeners in mind,
Of course.
the things they should know about this issue.
I think a good place to start would be by defining the problem. What is human trafficking exactly?
Yeah, that's a good point.
What makes it different from smuggling or forced labor?
Right, all those terms get kind of thrown around. And
Yeah, they do.
I think a lot of people, myself included, don't really know the nuances.
Sure. So smuggling, that's just about crossing borders illegally.
Okay.
Someone pays to get transported into a country. The big difference with trafficking is that it's all about exploitation.
Okay.
So it's the recruitment, transportation, harboring of people, and they use force, fraud, or coercion
Wow.
to exploit them.
So does that mean someone can be trafficked within the same city or state?
Yes, definitely.
They don't have to cross a border?
Nope, it's not just about moving them. It's about that control and exploitation,
Yeah.
using a person for someone else's gain.
So it could be forced labor,
Right.
sexual exploitation,
Yeah.
even forced marriage?
Yes. Even things like organ removal.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah,
And the scale of this is just mind-blowing.
it is.
This article says 27.6 million victims worldwide at any given time.
That's the estimate.
Is that accurate?
Yeah.
How do they even measure something like that?
Well, it's a huge number, and it shows how global this is.
Yeah,
It is hard to get exact figures, though.
I can imagine.
It's a hidden crime, and victims don't always come forward.
Makes sense.
They might be afraid, they might not trust the police, or they might not even realize they're being trafficked.
That's tough.
And it is
The U.S. is considered a Tier 1 country, but
by the State Department.
yeah, by the State Department,
Mm-hmm.
but we still have this problem.
We do.
So what does Tier 1 even mean?
Well, it doesn't mean we're free from trafficking.
Right.
It just means the government is trying hard to meet the minimum standards
Okay.
for eliminating trafficking.
I see.
These are standards from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act.
So things like punishing trafficking, protecting victims.
Yeah, and preventing future cases.
So it's more about the effort
Uh-huh.
than some kind of perfect scorecard.
Right, and trafficking can happen anywhere,
Yeah,
even in places with tough laws and lots of resources to fight it.
makes sense.
The article mentions that it often happens around international travel hubs
Okay.
with big immigrant populations like California,
Right.
Texas, Georgia,
Yeah, I can see, huh?
places with lots of diverse people and points of entry.
Yeah.
Those seem like obvious targets for traffickers.
Yeah. And then there's this whole issue of the numbers.
Yeah, it can be confusing.
How do we know how bad the problem really is?
It is a challenge.
This article even mentions a Washington Post expose from 2007 that said human trafficking in the U.S. was basically non-existent,
Yeah, I remember that one.
which I'm sure caused a lot of controversy.
It did.
So how do we reconcile those different perspectives?
Well, it's important to be critical.
Okay.
People who disagreed with that expose pointed out flaws
Right.
in the way they got their data,
Uh-huh.
and they said it didn't focus enough on the less obvious types of trafficking.
Like labor trafficking.
Exactly. They said that focusing only on those dramatic cases
Yeah.
kind of hid the reality of the exploitation happening within communities.
So we got to look beyond the headlines
We do.
and remember that trafficking has many forms,
That's right.
some of which are much harder to see.
Exactly. And those official numbers, even though they're important,
Yeah,
they only show us a small piece of the problem.
I see.
It's much bigger than that.
So let's talk about those two major types of trafficking. The article highlights sex trafficking and labor trafficking.
Right.
So I think most people have an idea what sex trafficking is.
Right.
But can you define it for us clearly?
Sure. So it's forcing or coercing someone into commercial sex acts,
Wait.
which could be prostitution, pornography,
Yeah.
or other types of sexual exploitation.
And it's often connected to organized crime
It is.
and complex schemes to deceive people.
Yeah, to control them.
The article mentions a historical parallel
Uh-huh.
to the white slave traffic of the early 1900s.
Yes. So back then,
What was that about?
young women, mostly white, were kidnapped or tricked into prostitution
Oh, wow.
in the U.S. and internationally. It caused a moral panic back then.
Wow. And even though things have changed,
They have.
this exploitation of people for sex is still happening.
Unfortunately, yes.
And it often targets the most vulnerable people in society.
It does.
This article talks about runaway children
Yes, very vulnerable.
and even gives the statistic 71% of 1.68 million runaways in 1999 were at risk for prostitution.
That's a lot of kids.
It's heartbreaking.
It is, and traffickers target them
Yeah.
because they're desperate.
Right, they're offering them like
Torture.
shelter and food
And a
and
sense of belonging.
yeah, and then they trap them.
Exactly.
The article also mentioned something I found surprising about the Super Bowl.
Oh, yeah.
Not as a cause, but like an opportunity for law enforcement
Right.
to conduct stings.
And sad but large events like that,
Yeah,
which draw huge crowds that can attract traffickers.
because of the demand.
Yeah, the increased demand for commercial sex. So law enforcement uses these events,
As an opportunity.
to conduct targeted operations.
Wow.
It shows how widespread this problem is.
Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about labor trafficking.
Sure.
How is that defined, and what are some ways it shows up in the U.S.?
So labor trafficking, according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act,
Oh, right.
is using force, fraud, or coercion to make someone work against their will.
So essentially modern-day slavery.
Pretty much. And it's happening in many industries.
Wow.
The article highlights some really striking examples like domestic servitude.
Yeah, someone trapped in an abusive household,
Right.
working for little or no pay.
It's awful.
It's terrifying.
It's a hidden form of exploitation that often affects migrant women
I see.
who are lured here with promises of a better life.
Right.
And then they end up isolated and controlled by their employers.
Another example that stood out to me was the traveling sales crews.
Mm-hmm.
The article says they have a high rate of hotline calls.
Yeah, because it's so mobile.
Right.
It's easy for traffickers to control and isolate their victims.
And Wisconsin has that law,
Yes, Melinda's Traveling Sales Crew Protection Act.
trying to address the exploitation in that industry.
Exactly.
It sounds like a positive step.
It is, but laws like this are just one piece.
Yeah.
To really fight labor trafficking, we need to look at the systemic factors that make people vulnerable in the first place.
Which leads us to the question of what fuels human trafficking.
Right.
This article talks about poverty, globalization, and the debate surrounding prostitution.
Big issues.
Let's start with poverty. How does that play into this?
Well, poverty creates desperation
Right.
and limited opportunities, making people susceptible to traffickers' promises of a better life.
Yeah, they're willing to take risks
Exactly.
because they're struggling to survive
And they might accept work even if it seems too good to be true.
because they just need something.
Right.
And what about globalization? How does that factor in?
Well, it's led to increased cross-border trade and a demand for cheap labor,
Oh.
often in countries with weak worker protections.
I see.
So while globalization has benefits, it also creates these unintended consequences.
Like opportunities for trafficking.
Exactly.
So it's not just about bad people, it's about
Systems.
the systems. Yeah.
Right, the economic forces
Right.
that create conditions for exploitation,
And then we have the whole debate about prostitution.
which adds another layer.
Yeah, the article mentions different feminist viewpoints. Some say that prostitution fuels sex trafficking,
Right.
while others believe that criminalizing it actually makes sex workers more vulnerable.
It's complicated, with good points on both sides.
Yeah, and it raises questions about agency.
Versus structural problems
Right.
and the role of law enforcement.
It's a lot to think about, and it seems like there are no easy answers
Not really.
when it comes to understanding and addressing the root causes of trafficking.
No, it's very complex.
It's a problem that needs a multifaceted approach.
It does.
And thankfully, there are people and organizations fighting back.
There are many.
But before we get into that, let's take a quick break.
So we were talking about the people and organizations fighting back against human trafficking.
Right. This is where I think we can start to feel some hope,
Hopefully. Yeah.
knowing that there are actual things being done to stop this.
Yep.
So let's start with the laws. What about the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act?
Yeah, the TVPO.
The TVPA, right, enacted in 2000.
That was a big one.
A landmark piece of legislation.
Absolutely.
Can you explain what it does?
Sure. So it has a few main parts.
Oh.
First, it makes the penalties for traffickers tougher.
Tougher penalties.
And then it gives resources for protecting and helping victims.
So it's not just about punishing the bad guys.
Right. It recognizes that victims need support.
Yeah, to escape those situations
Yeah.
and like rebuild their lives.
Exactly.
And it focuses on prevention too.
It does.
Education and outreach.
To try to stop it before it even happens.
And this act is where those Tier 1, 2, and 3 rankings come from.
Yes, it established that system.
Right, the ones we talked about earlier.
And the TVPA has been reauthorized several times since 2000.
So they've strengthened it.
Yes, each time they reauthorize it, they can strengthen certain parts.
Okay.
Or expand what it covers.
Like in 2008.
Yeah. The William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
What did that one do?
That one broadened protections for victims.
Okay.
Including provisions for T and U visas.
Can you explain those?
Sure. So T visas are specifically for trafficking victims. They allow them to stay in the U.S. legally.
That's huge.
And potentially get a green card.
Wow.
U visas are for victims of certain crimes, including trafficking, who have suffered serious abuse and are willing to help law enforcement.
So it's like a way for them to be safe?
Yes. It gives them legal status.
Without being deported.
Exactly.
That's really important.
It's about recognizing that they're not criminals.
Right.
They're survivors, and they deserve help.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The article also mentions a hotline.
Oh, yes. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline.
What's that for?
Anyone can call it.
Victims.
Yeah.
Anyone who suspects trafficking.
And what happens when you call?
They're staffed 24/7.
Oh.
And they can help in multiple languages.
That's good. So it reaches more people. Yes, they can connect you with local resources, give you information, and they can report tips to the police.
So it's like a crucial first step.
It is, especially for victims who don't know where else to turn.
Yes, and then there are these safe harbor laws.
Yes, those are important.
What are those all about?
They're meant to protect victims, especially minors,
Okay.
from being prosecuted for crimes they were forced to commit.
Oh, wow.
While they were being trafficked.
So they're not treated as criminals.
Right. It's recognizing that they were coerced.
Yeah.
And they need support, not punishment.
And what kind of support do they get?
Well, it often goes hand in hand with services like counseling, housing, job training.
To help them recover and build a new life.
Exactly.
It sounds like there's a growing movement to provide that kind of comprehensive support.
There is.
The article also mentions some state-level initiatives.
Oh, right. Like California's Transparency in Supply Chains Act.
What does that do?
It requires businesses to disclose what they're doing to get rid of slavery and trafficking.
From their supply chain.
It's exactly.
So it's about corporate accountability.
Yes. Making sure businesses aren't profiting from forced labor.
I see. So it's about attacking the problem from different angles.
Right.
Not just through law enforcement, but also through these businesses.
Exactly.
And it's not just governments and businesses doing this work.
No. There are lots of organizations on the front lines.
Can you tell us about some of them?
Sure. The article highlights a few that are really making a difference.
Okay.
Like the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, or CATW.
What do they do?
They advocate for policies that protect victims and prevent trafficking.
And what about the Global Alliance Against Trafficked in Women?
GAAW.
GATW.
Right.
They work to promote the rights of trafficked people.
Okay.
And advocate for different ways of addressing prostitution.
So both of those organizations are working on like the national and international level.
Yes, they're very influential.
And then there are local groups too.
Lots of them.
Working with specific communities.
Right. Like the article mentioned, Latin American populations are particularly vulnerable.
They are.
Why is that?
Well, there's several reasons. Language barriers and immigration status can make people more reliant on others.
Which makes them vulnerable.
Exactly. And the dangers they face crossing the border, often at the hands of the people they paid to help them.
It's awful.
It puts them in really risky situations.
And the article uses the term coyote.
Yes.
Which I always thought of as smuggling.
Right, but it can be a blurry line.
Between smuggling and trafficking.
It is sometimes what starts as smuggling. Turns into trafficking when the migrants are forced to work.
To pay off debts.
Exactly, in exploitative jobs or sex work.
It's so sad to think about people coming here for a better life.
It is.
And then this happens to them.
It's terrible.
And the article specifically mentions agriculture restaurants and domestic work.
Yes, those are common industries.
Where Latin American migrants are trafficked.
Right, because they're often hidden, isolated, and afraid to speak up.
For fear of losing their jobs.
Or being deported.
Right, that makes them easy targets.
It does.
And then there's the issue of sex trafficking within those communities.
Yes, often happening in bars and cantinas. Or through escort services.
Places where traffickers can prey on women and girls.
Exactly. They use deception, coercion, even violence.
To control them.
Yes. The article also mentions Latino residential brothels.
What are those?
They're a significant way that sex trafficking happens.
Okay.
And the victims are almost always women and children from Latin America.
That's horrifying.
It's a disturbing trend that shows how traffickers target specific communities.
Based on their vulnerabilities.
Right. They exploit those vulnerabilities.
Or like language barriers and immigration status.
Exactly, to control their victims.
So addressing this problem within these communities.
It requires a special approach.
A sensitive approach.
Yes, and working with organizations
Who understand the challenges.
that those communities face.
Right. Building trust and providing support
In a culturally appropriate way.
is crucial.
Absolutely, to reach those victims and help them escape.
Okay, so we've talked about the laws, the organizations, the specific vulnerabilities of certain populations. But let's zoom out for a minute and look at the bigger picture.
The systemic issues.
Yeah. The article mentions poverty, but also globalization.
Right.
How does globalization play a role?
Well, globalization, while it has some good points,
Yeah.
it's created new opportunities for traffickers.
Oh, so?
It's increased the demand for cheap labor,
Okay.
often in countries with weak labor laws.
Right.
And this combined with the fact that it's easier to move people across borders.
It's like it's made the world smaller,
In a way, yeah.
but also created this system where traffickers can operate more easily.
Exactly. With less risk.
And then we have the debate about prostitution,
Right.
which adds another layer of complexity.
It does.
As we mentioned before, there are different opinions about whether prostitution inherently fuels sex trafficking.
Or whether making it illegal makes sex workers more vulnerable.
Right, and those different viewpoints are reflected in the laws and policies.
Absolutely.
So different places have different approaches to prostitution.
They do, from full criminalization to decriminalization
Wow.
to even legalization in certain situations.
And those frameworks impact how trafficking is defined and investigated.
Then prosecuted.
So it seems like there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Not really.
Each place might need to tailor their approach.
Yes, based on the specific challenges they face.
It's about finding local solutions
That's key.
based on data and research.
And the experiences of the people on the ground.
Right, and involving survivors in those solutions.
Absolutely. Their insights are invaluable.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
They have.
The laws, the organizations, the vulnerabilities of different groups.
And the bigger societal factors.
It's a lot to process.
It's a complex issue, but I hope this deep dive
Yeah.
has helped shed some light on the realities of human trafficking.
It definitely has for me.
And what we can do to dismantle it.
It's been really eye-opening, and at times it felt overwhelming.
It can be.
But it's also encouraging to know there are so many people fighting back,
There are.
and that we can all do something.
We can.
But I'm wondering, what can we as individuals actually do?
That's a good question.
I mean, it's easy to feel helpless.
It is.
Like anything we do is just a drop in the bucket.
It can feel that way, but even small actions make a difference.
Like,
Awareness is key.
so you mentioned awareness. What does that actually look like, in our everyday lives?
Well, it starts with knowing the signs.
Okay, the signs of trafficking.
Learn to recognize the red flags, in different situations.
Like, what are some examples?
So think about it. Does a person seem really scared or anxious? Do they have signs of physical abuse or look malnourished?
Right?
Are they being restricted, in their movements or how they communicate?
I see.
Have their documents been taken away?
Those are all pretty clear signs.
Yes, those are potential warning signs.
So it's about paying attention to what's going on around us
Exactly, being observant.
and noticing when something seems wrong.
And if you see something suspicious, report it.
Okay, so call the hotline.
You can call the hotline or the police.
Right, so reporting is crucial.
It is.
But what else can we do besides just being vigilant?
Well, you can support organizations that are fighting trafficking.
Okay, so like donate money or volunteer?
Exactly. You can volunteer, donate, or even just spread awareness.
Click on social media.
Yeah, tell your friends and family.
Every little bit helps.
It all adds up, and we can also make choices in our own lives.
To reduce demand.
Yes, be mindful of where you shop and what you buy.
So like supporting ethical businesses.
Yes, support companies that are committed to fair labor practices.
So we're kind of voting with our wallets.
In a way, yes.
Choosing to support companies that treat their workers fairly.
Right. And when you travel, be aware of the risks of sex tourism.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Don't support businesses that exploit people.
We have to be responsible travelers.
We do.
And understand that our choices have an impact.
They do every action we take, even if it seems small.
Yeah,
It can help create a world where trafficking isn't tolerated.
that's a good point. This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
I'm glad.
It's a huge problem, but it's also inspiring.
It is.
Because see how many people are fighting back.
There are a lot of dedicated people out there.
And that we can all be part of the solution.
Beacon awareness, education, and action.
Those are our weapons.
They are.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
It's such an important topic, and I hope everyone listening will continue to learn about it.
You too.
And find ways to get involved.
Yeah.
There are resources out there.
There are.
Like the Players Project website.
Yes, that's a good one.
They can provide more information and connect you with organizations in your community.
Exactly.
So remember, even small actions can make a big difference.
They really can.
And if you see something that seems wrong, say something.
Don't be afraid to speak up.
Call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline.
That number is 1-888-373-7888.
It's available 24/7, and they can help in multiple languages.
It's a great resource.
So let's work together to shine a light on this hidden crime.
Yes, let's do it.
And create a world where everyone is free from exploitation.